the kind of things that India could do to state sponsors of terror and to terror perpetrators, I mean, there is really no difference. But India holds back because it is held to a higher moral standard. I mean, even lately, I've been having some arguments with Western scholars, and they always come down to we expect better out of India than it should, descend to such tactics.
Welcome to Start News Global, and welcome to the Gist. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Today we're going to look at this book. It's called Spies Among the Sands. It's about the Mossad, one of the world's premier intelligence agencies, so-called. And I have with me the author of this book, Prem Mahadevan. You've met him on the Gist before. He's come on our channel sometime before. Prem, congratulations. And how's this book doing?
Thank you very much, sir. It's a great honor to speak to you. The book has just come out, but it seems to have got a good reception. I've heard from certain quarters in Delhi that it's being read by people who are interested in the subject. Let's put it like that. So I'm rather happy with the initial feedback that I've got.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, it's how did you come across a subject like this? Mossad, Israel. I mean, I've read a lot of these books earlier. Most of them fairly, eulogizing how Mossad works and how efficient it is, and so on. You're given a different picture here. So tell me, first of all, how you came across a subject like this.
Thank you very much, sir. Well, three things drove me towards this topic. One was, as you said, when you look at Israeli accounts or even international accounts on the Mossad, they often focus on operational details. They're very
Yeah.
spicy, very entertaining reads. But if you look closely enough, you'll find that the exact operational details never line up. They differ in terms of where exactly something happened or who met whom. And an example of this, one of my favorite examples, is the killing of Imad Mugniyeh, the Hezbollah chief of special operations, in
Yeah.
2008. There are at least three different accounts of how he was killed. There's no disputing that he was killed by a bomb that was planted close to or on his vehicle in Damascus. But where exactly the bomb was planted? One account says it was in the headrest of the vehicle, of the driver's seat. Another is that it was in the spare tire. A third is that it was in the glove compartment of a car park next door. So the interesting thing is, all writers who claim to write about the Mossad's claim to have the true story, but the true story never seems to be someone else's true story. So that
Yeah.
was one factor which intrigued me. Another element was that over the course of my academic and research career, I have happened to interact with a number of Israeli scholars. A couple of them are friends of mine. And I observed in Europe and also elsewhere how they would very proactively lobby and network to push forward the Israeli narrative. There was nothing covert and nothing uh, uh, underhanded about what they were doing, but they were very openly advocating for Israel, putting forward the Israeli narrative. And in some cases, people were whispering about them that these guys are more than just academics. In one or two cases, the Israelis admitted very openly that they had an intelligence background. So I was struck by the access that some of these Israeli scholars had to European society, to areas of the intellectual elite that would normally be closed to people from outside the European Union and outside the European security context. And I was wondering how that has come about, how they could manage that. And also, I was impressed by how articulate and well informed they were of the region. The third reason why I wrote this book is actually a more kind of personal one, and that is after 26/11, I had a number of conversations with senior Indian security officials about how India could inflict punishment on the perpetrators of the attacks. And one of these gentlemen particularly said to me, look, we can't do the covert activities that Israel does. Not that we lack the capability to do it. We can do that even tomorrow. But our political and our sort of the international moral constraints that are imposed on us prevent us from having the same kind of free hand that the Israelis enjoy. And that was really the trigger. I was wondering, what is it that's particular about Israel that allows the Mossad, for all its operational brilliance, and it is undoubtedly
Yeah.
very good at its work, but what are the political factors and the structural factors that enable it to be so successful?
Mhm. You mentioned international constraints imposed on us, moral constraints. These are not things that we have come up with, they have come from outside, and we feel duty bound to follow that, is it?
Yes, unfortunately so. I mean, the kind of things that India could do to state sponsors of terror and to terror perpetrators, I mean, there is really no difference. But India holds back because it is held to a higher moral standard. I mean, even lately, I've been having some arguments with Western scholars, and they always come down to, we expect better out of India than it should, descend to such tactics. I mean, it's a kind of, I would call it moral blackmail. Actually, I don't think there's any better word for it, because I've looked at some of the say unpleasant things that Western intelligence agencies have done. I'm talking about Anglo-Saxon ones.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you get into an argument with them, with people who sort of hold India to this higher moral standard, then they'll say, don't resort to whataboutism or whataboutery. We are talking
Yeah.
about you, not about us. But the reality is that there's a lot of skeletons in the cupboard with regard to Western intelligence agencies. So, yeah.
Um, let's get back to Israel and Mossad. Was it easy getting through to people, talking to people in Israel, to the academic community, to those who have taken part in such operations? Was it easy to get access?
No, sir, it wasn't actually. And to be honest, most of what I have written in this book is really coming from open sources. You see, the Israelis, understandably, um, are very cautious about who they would speak to on security
Yeah.
matters like this. It's by invitation only, and I was always on the periphery. I was never anywhere near the core or the inside of the Israeli security community. My friends and were also academics. We must remember that between academics, there's a certain degree of openness, which is definitely not there when you're talking to a practitioner,
Okay.
who. So it's not the same thing. And I'll give you a very small example. Israel has the Signals Intelligence Unit, very well known, Unit 8200. You
Yeah.
just have to go on Google and you can find out about it. But I was once watching a documentary where a member of Unit 8200 was being interviewed, and she was obviously an Israeli soldier, and she had no idea that the world outside Israel knew of 8200's existence. So she was kind of horrified, and she thought a security breach had occurred, that the existence of this top secret unit was widely known. So what I'm trying to say is there is a very closed culture. I must admit that I was not able to penetrate, actually. So what the material in my book has come from the writings of Israeli scholars in English. Thankfully, a lot of them write in English, and it has also come from Hebrew language sources, which I had translated, or had got translated, and I was able to access that for operational uh, level material. But it was all historical stuff. I mean, historical stuff obviously is less sensitive, so it tends to enter the public domain, even if it's only in Hebrew.
So, reading your book, you've cataloged a lot of failures of Mossad. And when you look at what happened last October, the Hamas attack and the war that's still going on, would you say Mossad has really failed here? Was it the responsibility of some other agency?
Well, sir, yes. To start with, this is not really a Mossad failure, I would say. It's a failure of the military intelligence service. First and foremost, it's a failure of the political leadership. Now, no one's going to talk too much about that, certainly not the
Yeah.
incumbent leadership in Israel, because there's no reason for them to draw attention to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Mossad, as I understand it, spent the years prior to October 7th tracking Hamas internationally, tracking its funding, its strategic talks with various partners, money laundering, especially. Mossad was focused on that, trying to trace Hamas's financial interests. So I don't think that one can really blame the Mossad in this case. Uh, at most one can say that maybe they could have picked up some incidental chatter and they didn't, but we really don't know enough at this stage. There will definitely be some inquiries, a commission perhaps, which would, examine these issues. So, but yeah, I would not blame the Mossad in this case. I would say it was much more a failure of military intelligence, a failure of security, and above all, a failure of policy.
Mhm. And when these internal investigations happen, are they in that sense geared towards finding what the problems were, pinpointing accountability, taking action, or are they like here a little gray? I mean, kind of things, kind of just we hear nothing about it. How are the Israelis when it comes to accountability?
Well, so we have the example of the Yom Kippur War before us. Now, I would say that every country, no matter how open they claim to be, is always going to be a bit gray. The story, the narrative is going to be steered usually away from the political leadership,
Yeah.
towards a couple of scapegoats. I mean, it's even alleged actually in the case of the Yom Kippur War that this is of course alleged, but when I was researching on this book, I came across one claim that the Israelis, after the Yom Kippur War, had agreed how responsibility was going to be divided up, and who would basically take the blame and how far they would be then punished, so to speak.
Hmm.
So they would be blamed but not disgraced. That was the approach that was taken. So I mean, I would say the main value of these commissions is that they bring out knowledge or information, insights, which we as outsiders simply cannot expect to have. We learn
Hmm.
about who the key personalities were, what they said to each other in meetings. Of course, this is all sanitized. I mean, no one reaches a level of seniority, a very high level of seniority in government without learning to watch their back and thinking about what's going to sound good in for posterity, or what will make them look smarter than their colleagues or more prescient than their colleagues. And there have been such allegations even with regard to the Yom Kippur War, when the level of intrusiveness and scrutiny of policymakers was much lower than it is today. So I would definitely expect that even as we're going on now, even now, there'll be an effort to um, to steer the narrative. And I'll give you just one example, sir. When the killing of Yitzhak Rabin happened,
Yeah.
according to one Israeli journalistic account which I read, a senior officer in the Shin Bet, that is, or the Shabak rather, that is Israel's domestic security service, rushed into headquarters and met his senior and said, "Listen, let's agree on one thing. I warned you, and you knew about what was going to happen." Now, of course, this is the journalist's interpretation of what occurred, but it does show that as soon as a major breach happens, everyone's looking for that odd scrap of paper, that email, which will vindicate them and say that, look, I'm not going to take the fall for this collective failure. It's everyone's responsibility, therefore it's no one's responsibility. One or two heads have to roll if public opinion is too outraged. I mean, that's it's a very cynical formula, and perhaps some would argue I'm being too cynical, but I think it applies in many countries.
So not very different from here, from what you're telling me.
So I would argue that it's universal the world over. I mean, I'm not sort of saying this is unique to Israel. I'm saying this applies everywhere. But yes, I mean, we in India there's this approach that we tend to condemn ourselves very effectively, perhaps too often, and then foreign commentators latch on to this and very gleefully repeat what is said by Indians and say that,
Hmm.
well, I'm not being racist, I'm not being Indophobic. It's the Indians themselves who are saying this. So,
Yeah.
it's handing a loaded gun to one's critics. One can't really blame them for, then bashing India when it comes to security matters.
So coming back to Israel again, um, you agree that there's been colossal failure at the intelligence level and the political level. What about this war, and the way Israel is pursuing it? Where do you see this? Is there a way out? I mean, how does it end, or is there an end at all?
Well, so obviously, the war will end at some stage, but I think there is general agreement now that Israel does not have a plan. I mean, let's not forget this war was forced on Israel. I mean,
Yeah,
despite the
absolutely.
massive damage that has been inflicted on the population of Gaza, which is understandably aroused international sympathy and some degree of anger, the fact is that the war was forced on Israel by Hamas. There is no changing that reality. And Israel is responding what they believe it's very legitimate self-defense, and more importantly, when you are reacting to something which the other guy has done and he's planned over a period of perhaps 2 years to do
Yeah.
this, uh, you kind of make up your strategy on the go. Now, there is this view that Israel eventually is looking to dominate the Gaza Strip in some way, perhaps
Yeah.
reoccupy it. I mean, that is very speculative at this stage. But I would say the only thing that is clear is that Israel wishes to inflict very severe damage on Hamas. And crucially, what they want to do is deny any visuals, any optics that would give Hamas the sense of a victory. So, in all previous engagements where Israel has gone into Gaza and they've eventually left, Hamas has claimed victory, saying we threw the Israelis out. Even
Yeah.
though the Israelis clearly had the upper hand in all these engagements, Hamas has pointed out that the Israelis did leave and they say it was due to them. So, this time the Israelis want to make sure that there is no trace whatsoever of even a partial 1% success that Hamas can claim. So they want to make it clear that the organization has been defeated, politically, if not militarily, at the very least.
Mhm. Do you think that's the realistic way forward?
I think, sir, here we enter into the realm of semantics, because
Yeah.
scholars typically tend to argue that ideas can't be defeated, and
Mm.
terrorist movements will always regenerate, and there is some merit to this school of thinking. But eventually, if you're looking at defeating or killing an organization by just totally wiping out its leadership and really inflicting very heavy damage on its cadres, that is possible. I think right now, the Israelis certainly want to degrade Hamas's military potential, which I believe they are going to succeed in doing quite a bit.
Hmm.
What they cannot change, and I think they very well understand this, is they cannot change the level of intense hostility that exists
Absolutely.
towards
Yeah.
them in the region,
Mhm.
in the wider region. And so, to that extent, they know that the ideas are going to live on. They have kind of disassociated the destruction of or the discrediting of Hamas's ideas. They don't, I think, really aim for that as a campaign objective. What they want to do is inflict physical damage, which is possible, in my opinion, even if it attracts a lot of international outrage.
What does this tell us about Hamas? The way they've planned this operation, the tactics they used, and the fact they're able to continue with this war 6 months down the line. What does it tell us about them?
This is actually a very interesting question, sir, because this is definitely going to be studied. The attacks are going to be studied across the world. I mean, I would just go back 2 years and to the American withdrawal from Kabul. Now, we all predicted at that time that this is going to lead to a rise of militancy, of terrorist violence, and I would argue that even Hamas's attack is part of that wave. I mean, later on, scholars might look at the American withdrawal from Kabul and say that, this triggered off another wave of militancy. Because we
Mhm.
must remember, when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, no one at that time thought that this would lead to Islamist militancy in the 1990s. It was retrospectively that people
Yeah.
made that connection. So we could see the same happening here. To answer your question specifically on Hamas and its tactics, there were certain things which surprised me. Of course, the tactical sophistication of the attacks is possible for any group if you give them enough time. I mean,
Mm.
give them enough preparation time, give them a safe haven to do their planning and training, and any group can mount a fairly sophisticated attack. The more interesting elements are intelligence gathering. Now, Hamas typically has relied on open source intelligence from Israel for its strategic assessment. A lot of Hamas's leaders have been in Israeli jails. Some of them have learned Hebrew, like the Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, has learned Hebrew. He was in jail for a very long period of time. So these people think they understand the Israeli psyche, and they kind of go by almost an intuition, but they're not very systematic about strategic assessment.
Mhm.
What was surprising, however, is the level of tactical intelligence gathering which went into planning this attack. And I would say that here, the 19,000 Gazans who would cross into Israel every day, to work, almost certainly, I mean, it's logical that some of them were Hamas scouts. They were
Yeah, yeah,
exploring, weak spots and the level of security preparedness. Now,
yeah.
those are the kinds of factors that are worrying for a security planner, because when you have a somewhat normal society, a normalized situation, how do you really prevent someone from coming in, scouting for an attack that may happen a few years in advance? Hezbollah
Mm,
is very interesting in this regard. Hezbollah is much more sophisticated than Hamas when it comes to intelligence gathering, because Hezbollah, that is, have ties with organized crime gangs that operate across the Israeli-Lebanon border.
mhm,
So they can gather human intelligence from within Israel using their drug smuggling networks. And
mhm.
we do know of cases where Hezbollah has managed to send operatives into Israel through third countries, like David Headley equivalents,
Yeah.
who reconnoitered targets and got out safely without the Israelis catching them. It was only later on that people realized that guy was a Hezbollah operative. So Hamas is not thought to have that capability, which was perhaps why they launched a cross-border attack rather than something that was very deep inside Israel and used covert support networks and so on. But they are sophisticated, much more than was thought to be the case before October 7th.
Mhm. And you think Israel has lost its deterrent? You talk about it in your book also. But does this attack suggest that Israel is no longer held in that kind of perhaps fear, respect?
I think sir, Israel will continue to be held with a certain degree of fear and respect, if nothing else, for what the amount of damage that they can inflict on their
Yeah.
adversaries. That will cause the adversaries to fear them, not respect necessarily. And I think the point about respect is interesting, because Israeli intelligence has always been associated with very sophisticated covert operations. I mean,
Mhm.
you take some of the killings that have happened in Iran, for example.
Yeah.
If they were carried out by the Mossad, then some of them were very sophisticated, right? And that's something which in intelligence circles is always considered as a point to brag about. We could eliminate this guy with zero collateral damage, with no operatives getting caught, with no trace being left to us. That's the kind of thing that intelligence officers are very happy or very pleased about when they can carry out such an operation, those that are in this kind of paramilitary stuff. um, the problem for Israel is that no matter what, there's no separating the fact that its counterterrorism successes, not just in Gaza now, but over the last 20 years, have been associated with the use of overt military force
Mhm.
and with a certain level of, I don't want to use the word brutality because that's judgmental, but let's say
Yeah.
there's a certain blatantness or a blatant quality to
Mhm.
this use of force, which is different from the Israel of the 1960s and 70s. When people look back to the Mossad, they think of the operation to eliminate Black September
Yeah.
operatives in Europe. And, they say that, oh, that's the kind of thing. Well, that was pretty much a very rare occurrence, actually. The Mossad has, of course, carried out a number of other assassinations, or is thought to, but those are fairly sophisticated ones which are not really traced back to Israel. So I think within the security communities of the world, the intelligence
Mhm.
services, there will continue to be a certain degree of respect for Israel, definitely some sympathy for the challenges that the Mossad and other Israeli agencies face. But there'll also be a recognition that these guys are human. They're not superhuman, no matter what thriller writers say. They are prone to making mistakes. And I think intelligence officers already know this. October 7th will just be a reiteration of that.
Mhm. So, looking back after your experience of writing this book, would you say that Israel has triumphed more because of the ineptitude of its Arab neighbors, or there is something here that the Israelis have in them, some motivation, whatever it is, which drives them to have the kind of success that they've seen in all these years?
I would certainly agree, sir, that there is I mean, ineptitude is always a harsh word. One could argue
Yeah.
that the Jordanian intelligence services is also very professional. I mean, there have been specialists who have made that argument, specialists in intelligence who worked with both the Israelis and the Jordanians. So I'm not, I think it would differ depending on the actual opponent and the actual operation as such. But I would agree that Israel has benefited from, first, a very clear sense of focus that we will never allow anything that even looks like the Holocaust, or that even reminds us of the Holocaust, to happen again. We are going to make sure that our enemies pay a very heavy price for shedding our blood. And that clarity, I think, is a little bit unusual. It's unique to Israel because of the traumatic experience of the
Yeah, yeah.
Holocaust. I mean, it was horrendous what happened, and it has scarred the psyche of the people, rightly so, actually. So there's that. Then I think the real factor is also a high level of international sympathy in certain quarters of the world. I'm talking particularly about the West here, and I come back to the point that we made in the beginning. There are certain things that the Israelis can do, which other countries are um, prohibited or prevented from doing. I mean, let's look at the fact that, if a lot of Israel's success against Iran seems to
Sorry.
be enabled. I say seems
Yeah.
because this is only going by what I've read in open sources, but it seems to be enabled by international intelligence partners as well. So this is not just some Israeli genius. There is a intelligence coalition which targets Iran and which shares information. So on that basis, I think we have to understand that the Israelis benefit from having a number of security partners, and also they are very focused and determined. Then they have a militarized society, which is a huge asset. That's something which we in India don't quite understand. In India, there's this view
Yeah.
that the governments are only the governments. I'm a common man. I should not be involved in them. I don't need to take a reflexive stance of supporting the government. Although Israel is a democracy, a vibrant one, there is a certain clarity about where people's loyalties lie. There is not this kind of compartmentalization that
Yeah.
I am sort of removed from policy decisions because it's a smaller country and there's a greater sense of being besieged, I feel.
Great talking to you, Prem, and I hope your book sells well. And I hope there's a sequel, maybe something on Hamas, for instance. There'll be a lot of readers here for that.
Thank you very much, sir. You're very kind. And yes, I'm looking at future projects as well. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to speak to you, and I very much appreciate the time.
Great. Thanks a lot, Prem. Thanks for your time, and all the very best. That's all we have for you on this edition of The Gist. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good day.